Today we'll be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Alaska. To do this, I have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this data on filings comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows filings by year since 1990 in the state. During that time, there have been about 29,000 cases filed in Alaska. In the early 1990s, filings were running about 1,000 per year. From, say, 1998 to 2004, very consistent at about 1,500 per year. Big jump in 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, followed by a huge drop down to only about 600 cases in 2006. Filings went back up, nearly doubled by 2010 as the recession was taking place, and then have dropped off to under 500 by 2015. So right now, filings are only about 1/3 of where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform, and only about 1/2 of where they were 25 years ago in Alaska. This chart shows filings relative to population over time, and Alaska has a very low rate. It's actually by far the lowest in the country, 59% below average. The highest rates tend to be in the southeast, and Tennessee is the clear winner on this over time. And the difference between Alaska and Tennessee is that someone in Tennessee is more than 5 times as likely to file bankruptcy as somebody in Alaska. Now, looking at it year by year, virtually every year, Alaska has the lowest bankruptcy filing rate. And right now, the gap is probably even getting greater, so that filings are only about 1/3 of the national average. Looking at Chapter 7 filings per year, and this very much follows the total filings chart, under 1,000 back in the early 1990s, running up to about 1,300 per year from, say, 97 to 2004, a spike in 2005, drop off, some increase, and then back down to a very low rate, and only about 1/4 of where of the historical average, or the pre-reform average, let's say. Looking at Chapter 11 cases per year, they're much higher in the early 1990s, very big drop-off. Since then, say from about 1998 to 2015, there's only averaged about 10 Chapter 11 filings per year. And sometime in 2015, there's a much higher volume, but about 10 of these were related cases in the Miller Energy case. In 2016, there's only been 7 cases filed so far this year, so not too much Chapter 11 activity in Alaska. Looking at Chapter 13 cases, they actually dropped off through the early 90s and then stayed between 100 and 150 a year for really most years, and most recently have dropped off some too. And right now they're about half of where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. Look at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13. Nationwide, the average has been right around 30% most years, some disruption around before and after bankruptcy reform. In Alaska, from 1990 to 2005, we're running right around 10% per year, and getting up to 15 to 17% range over the last decade. Now, this next chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Alaska, and this is kind of a proxy of how the economy is going. And the Alaska chart is really unlike any other state. There's none that are close. If you look at the national average, we had running in 4 to 5% range, then a big jump up to almost 10% for the recession, and a drop back down to about 5%. In Alaska, the figure has just stayed at 6 to 8% every quarter for 10 years now. And there's no other state that has had an unemployment rate that has stayed in such a narrow range. Now, filings peaked nationwide in September 2010 and have been falling. By June 2016, the national average was down 49%. The biggest declines were in the Northeast, the Southwest, and Alaska and Hawaii also had big declines. The biggest, or the smallest declines have been in the Southeast, where they have a lot of Chapter 13 cases. But Alaska at 60% has had a very substantial decline. And actually, throughout the Ninth Circuit, there's been much larger than average decline. If you look since 2010, filings in Ninth Circuit are down 65%, where the rest of the country they're down about 43%. And so even though things are down 60% in Alaska, California, Nevada, and Arizona have had bigger declines over time. Now, looking at the filing trends by quarter, you can see that the biggest declines in Alaska occurred from, say, 2012 to early 2015. Sometimes got up to as much as 30%. Although on this, looking at quarterly figures in a state that doesn't really get that many cases, it doesn't take much of a change in absolute number of cases to make a big impact on this chart. But nationwide, the decline was in between 10 to 15% most quarters, and it's slowing down recently. And actually, the first 2 quarters of this year, Alaska had were exactly the same as last year. So there's no change for Alaska. You can see about 15 states that are colored red are actually increasing right now, although there are still some big increases, particularly on the West Coast and Florida. And some of the states that had the biggest increases are still showing big declines in filings. As far as the outlook goes, Alaska is just kind of a different animal than most other states. The unemployment rate in the state is higher than average now. Government out there accounts for about a quarter of the jobs, compared to about 15% nationwide, and 90% of the state revenue comes from oil and gas, which is very unusual. But production is down 23 of the last 24 years, so production of gas is down 75%. So they've got big deficits, but the payment fund out there still has about $50 billion in it, so it's definitely not a Puerto Rico situation. As far as where filings go, I think we'll see maybe a slight increase this year, and filings will be in the 5 to 7, 800 range most years in the next few years probably. I don't see filings returning to 1,500 per year unless there's some legislative changes or another recession hits. But and I think there's not much prospect that any place will replace Alaska as having the lowest bankruptcy rate in the country. Well, that concludes this look at bankruptcy filings in Alaska. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.